Good afternoon. Welcome to the Insight webinar from Telecoms and Tech Academy. Today the topic is the Internet of Things, where we'll have a quick look at some of the market trends, the business and technology aspects of IoT. Now this will be around about 30 minutes or so. At the end, I'll change the screen and you'll have an opportunity to download the slide deck that we're using for today and to ask any questions that you might have about the topics that we've covered. So let's make a start. Let's begin. So first of all, who we are. So of course we're the Telecoms and Tech Academy. If you want to know more about what we do in terms of training for your company, then of course you can visit us at the telecomstechacademy.com, where you'll find out everything that we do, all of the programs that we can manage for your company. So again, I'll put that link up towards the end of the session, and you'll be able to visit us directly from that link. Right now, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about IoT today. So, of course, the Internet of Things, which is I don't know, to me, a little bit of a strange title, I suppose. It's very descriptive in what it does, but I guess it bears a little bit of definition. I think perhaps the most well-known thing about the Internet of Things is that there will be a lot of it, and it covers many different industry sectors. So we're talking about healthcare, connected cars, smart cities, intelligent transportation systems, and so on and so forth. One of the ways I like to think about the Internet of Things opportunity is that if a particular thing requires a battery to make it work, or indeed a power cord in order for it to operate, then it has in the future the potential to be a connected thing, whatever that thing might be. Whether we're talking about light bulbs or street lights or signage, any of those things that require some sort of electrical source really does have this potential to be a connected thing. And I guess that's one of the reasons why when we think about the potential size of the market, various organizations have made predictions about, by 2030, 2040, that there will literally be billions of things that may well be connected. And I guess that's no exaggeration, really. It does sound like an enormous number of things that might be connected. But one of the challenges, of course, is to turn that, those billions of things that may or may not be connected to the internet, and turn that into a business. Now, I guess there's two broad categories of business that we always think about in telco. There is the B2B market, of course, the business-to-business market, and then maybe the business-to-consumer market, the B2C market. Now, most operators, in one sense or another, will have some sort of your direct consumer-led market, but also the wholesale, the enterprise, which we would, fall into the category of the B2B. But I think there's an emerging category, not a new category necessarily, but an emerging category, which is the B2B2C market. Now that's a theme that we'll kind of explore in this session, because one of the things that we're going to talk about really is how do we, from an operator's perspective, how do we expand our ecosystem or our footprint in order to manage the evolution or to change the influence that we might have in this particular industry. So clearly, the operators, the CSPs, the communication service providers, have got a large role to play here. But the big question, perhaps, is the role that the CSP plays. Is it just connectivity, or is there something more that the operator might be able to do? So this is what I mean by kind of expanding that footprint, expanding our sphere of influence, if you like, within this massive ecosystem that will be driven from the Internet of Things. So on the other side of that, of course, there will be many industries, so-called connected verticals, and the CSP sits right in the middle there, joining these two things together. So whilst on the other hand, in terms of devices, we might have, or at least on the right-hand side, the billions and billions of devices. On the left-hand side of the screen here, really, we're talking about all of these connected verticals, which may be, may be numbered in the thousands or tens of thousands, and that perhaps gives a little bit of insight into the scale of the potential industry, because on the one hand, the operator has got a very direct problem to solve in how do we connect hundreds of millions or billions of things to the network. But on the other side, so when we're going out towards the left-hand side of the screen, then of course what these arrows really represent is not just connections in this case, but these are business agreements, contracts that we would have to have with these organizations. So we have to have a bit of an understanding, I think, about exactly what the requirements of these various industries might be. Both in terms of the directly the connectivity requirements, but what their business requirements are as well. So if we use this term, this B to B to C, so business to consumer, of course, then really what these sort of red arrows on the left hand side represent is a business agreement with another company, and not just a straightforward wholesale or enterprise form of agreement, but it's a slightly deeper understanding of knowing what the consumer requirements are in the direction of those businesses. We'll give a couple of examples of how operators are attempting to expand their footprint, their influence, or their ecosystem as we go through this. Now that there are quite a lot of so-called complicated definitions, I suppose, of what IoT might be. Now, I think maybe IoT is sort of the new name for machine to machine in some sense, but there's a way of looking at this whereby we can define something which is both machine to machine and the IoT, both on the consumer side and directly on the enterprise side as well. So if we consider, first of all, again on the left, on the right hand side of the diagram here, we've got both consumer machine to machine and consumer IoT. Now, I guess in both cases these would be sort of locally connected, so local area connected type devices, and the operators may well have some degrees of or aspirations of service-based models, but that might be quite a hard thing to break into. I think particularly on the consumer IoT side, depending what categories we consider, so wearables, smart homes, that kind of thing, that might be quite a difficult market to break into over and above just providing basic connections. But I think if we consider it more of a machine to machine, it looks a bit more like a B2B model or maybe a B2B2C model. Certainly when you consider things like connected cars, for example, that requires that we've got fairly detailed or deep agreements with the vehicle businesses, in that we understand what their requirements are and what their consumer requirements might be. Now it's a bit of a fine distinction, I suppose, when you move to that, because from an operator perspective, we may not be selling the service directly to the person who is purchasing the car. That may look more like an enterprise level service. So there would be an enterprise agreement between the operator and somebody like Tesla, for example. And I think when you consider it from an enterprise perspective, there's a much more there's a more scalable business model there, perhaps, where the focus will be on things like large-scale data collection. And I think maybe there might be revenue opportunities there, not just in the device itself, but both in the device and the service sector. I think on the consumer side, where we believe that most of the revenues will be driven through hardware sales, and this is the end point, so the devices, the modems, and so on, because of course we're counting these things now in terms of billions, so that'll be a huge business or a huge business potential. But if we're an operator, for example, then we're not necessarily going to get into the business of building the hardware, writing code and drivers and so on for the modem. That might not be seen as the primary business that we want to be in, and we might want to be in the service sector or around about the service sector, rather than actually in the in the hardware market itself. We'll leave that to the people that have got perhaps better expertise in that. But yeah, that's the key question, mentioned a couple of times now. But in order to validate the market relevance, we've got to be able to find an answer to the question, what is our position in that overall value chain? So exactly what are we doing? Are we just connection providers, or are we providing a much greater scope of service, not just for the consumers at the end of this value chain, but also the businesses, the verticals that might sit behind those or within those ecosystems as well. Now this is quite a good chart. I like this chart that the Ovum analysts have put together, because it deals with both the industry verticals, which is a thing that we're quite familiar with, I think, these days. And the industry verticals would be typically, and not exhaustively, but agriculture, mining, business, energy, utilities, finance, government, and so on. So a fair list of various industry verticals we may consider in partnering with. But it's also interesting to see this compared with, or at least creating a matrix with, the so-called application verticals. So you've got things, of course, like asset tracking, your connected cars, consumer electronics, and so on across the top here. Now, this is the colours that you see in the middle of the chart here are really related to the market potential. So, of course, if we consider something like agriculture, mining with asset tracking, for example, then there is a fairly high potential market there. But perhaps the way that I read this picture is, if we look at the application verticals and we look for all sort of the red or the pink squares in here, then asset tracking, for example, seems to have a lot of market potential across a lot of different industry verticals. So from maybe an operator's viewpoint, then it may appear that something like asset tracking is an essential skill to have, because it's relevant to many different industry verticals. And again, when you look at things like security and surveillance, for example, if we could develop that capability, that skill, create platforms that allow us to hook into the idea of maybe security and surveillance, whatever skill that we learn, provided it's made general enough with the right kind of APIs to allow the verticals to easily connect to, then of course we're making ourselves much more capable, much more attractive to many other verticals. There may be some sort of very niche aspects to this. I think particularly sort of in medical and healthcare, depending exactly what type of service, like robot surgery, for example, is one that we kind of tout out, we push out quite a lot. But robot surgery is such a niche application. And requires very, very sort of sophisticated and secure communication skills, then maybe that's not an area of huge interest in terms of overall market potential. But it is interesting to see the potential applications that can be applied to the different industry verticals. So that gives you a little bit of insight, I think, into maybe where the potentially attractive markets might be. And of course, when you're drawing out your company roadmap, that perhaps would enable you to think about the specific or essential skills that you would have to develop within the organization, both from a company organization, an HR perspective, but also in terms of the digital transformation that many companies are going through. We need to kind of think very carefully and decide about what services, products, and features, and so on that we actually need to build into the network in order to scale our companies to be able to serve many different industries. Now, this idea of scale, I think, is one of the most important issues when it comes to IoT, because there's nothing really. There are no new ideas here. We've kind of been playing around with these ideas for probably a couple of decades or so. We've got some, fairly minor machine-to-machine type services in there. So none of these ideas are new necessarily, and I'm sure we could come up with some, really complicated example for a particular application on a particular vertical, and we could define all of the properties of it, and we would find that our current generation of network technologies, so that means all of the network connectivity, the operational support systems,